The studio lights burned brighter than the morning sun, illuminating a stage meant for charm and calm. Good Morning America was never built for chaos. It was built for smiles, for soft news, for polite interviews that sent people off to work with their coffee still warm. But on this morning, the show transformed into something else entirely. A courtroom without robes, a confessional without forgiveness. Will Smith sat rigid in his chair. The man who had once danced across living rooms as the Fresh Prince now carried the stiffness of a soldier on trial. His tailored suit seemed to choke him, the collar high, the fabric pressed to perfection, yet no wardrobe could press out the cracks in his composure. The cameras rolled, the red light blinking like an unblinking judge's eye. Across from him, Michael Strahan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice calm but edged with steel. Years of NFL battles had carved a presence into him that no studio makeup could soften. He wasn't there to flatter. He was there to probe, to press, to peel away the polished exterior that Smith's team had no doubt scripted for days. "Will," Strahan began, the words precise, almost surgical. "America watched you lose control at the Oscars. You struck another man on live television. Why should they trust you now?" The question hit the room like a gavel slammed down. There was no laugh track to cover the silence, no applause sign to break the tension, just air, heavy and unyielding, as the audience, both in the studio and across millions of living rooms, leaned closer. Smith's eyes darted for a fraction of a second, the kind of movement only high-definition cameras could betray. His lips parted, then closed, as though the right words were rehearsed but had fled the courtroom of his mind. Finally, he exhaled, his voice dropping low, ragged. "You don't get to judge my humanity off one mistake." It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. A broken shard of glass, glinting with equal parts pain and defiance. Gasps escaped from the small studio audience. Producers behind the glass exchanged nervous glances, hands twitching near earpieces. The set, usually a place of controlled brightness, suddenly felt volatile, like a storm had entered without warning. Strahan didn't flinch, his eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed measured. "One mistake? Or the most public unraveling of your career?" The words carried no malice, but they pressed against Smith's chest like a weight. His shoulders shifted, his hands clasped, then unclasped, restless. The narration of the moment was written in body language, a man who had commanded stages now struggling to command his breath. The silence between them thickened, stretching seconds into eternities. Millions at home felt it, the raw discomfort of watching a myth collapse, a pedestal shake. Social media feeds would soon ignite, but in this frozen instant, the studio was an arena, the world its audience. And as Smith steadied himself, lifting his chin with stubborn resolve, one thing became clear. This was no longer a morning interview. This was a trial. And Will Smith's every word, every tremor, every flicker of anger or pain was now evidence before the jury of a nation still haunted by the night of the slap. The gavel had struck, the case had begun. The world remembers the sound before the sight, the crisp, shocking echo of palm against cheek. March 27th, 2022. The Oscars. Chris Rock standing under the blinding glow of Hollywood's most celebrated stage, a joke still hanging in the air, when Will Smith's frame moved across the camera with the velocity of disbelief. The slap cracked across the Dolby Theater, across millions of television screens, across the collective conscience of a nation that worshipped civility but consumed spectacle like blow. Oddsport. The footage replayed endlessly, every angle, every slowed frame, every gasp from the audience dissected like evidence in an open trial. Smith's words, "Keep my wife's name out your," censored on some broadcasts, uncensored on others, became scripture for memes, think pieces, podcasts, late-night ridicule. It was not just an incident, it was a rupture. By the time Smith resigned from the Academy, America had already rendered 100 verdicts. Some declared him violent, unhinged, an emblem of unchecked celebrity. Others, especially in corners of Black Twitter, framed him as a man under unbearable pressure, lashing out not from cruelty but exhaustion, the breaking of a dam that had been filling for decades. Now, months later, sitting in that sterile Good Morning America studio, Every camera lens seemed to carry the ghost of that night. Every word Strahan asked bore the weight of a nation still circling the same wound. Strahan folded his hands, his voice steady. "You've said it was a moment of weakness. But weakness in front of millions carries consequences. Do you understand why people can't just let it go?" Smith's eyes darkened, not in anger, but in something heavier. Recognition. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, before speaking low. "Because it wasn't just about me. It was about what I represented. I broke the image they had of me." The admission hung in the air, a confession disguised as explanation. Narration swelled to meet the moment. For 30 years, Smith had been the embodiment of control, the smiling sitcom star, the blockbuster hero who saved worlds without a scratch, the rapper who rapped about parents and summer without profanity. America built him into a paragon of safety, a rare figure beloved across race, class, and geography. But the slap shattered that mythology. In seconds, the man who once symbolized harmless joy was recast as dangerous, unpredictable, fallible. The public, restless jury that it was, struggled with the contradiction. Opinion writers penned their indictments. Violence has no excuse. Pundits filled airwaves with accusations. Privilege shields him from true punishment. Cultural critics turned the lens wider. What does this mean for black masculinity in Hollywood? For anger? For pain? Every debate circled back to one truth. The slap was more than a gesture. It became a symbol. And symbols, unlike men, do not apologize their way into forgiveness. Strahan's tone sharpened slightly, as though reading the collective mind of America. "You resigned from the academy. You apologized publicly. But still, people hesitate. They see the slap before they see the work, before they see the man. Do you feel trapped by that moment?" Smith leaned back, the tension in his jaw betraying him even as he tried to relax. His voice carried both defiance and fatigue. "I feel defined by my worst second, when I've given 30 years of my life trying to do right. That's the trap." The narration drew out the image. A man who had conquered box offices, who had filled stadiums with laughter, who had woven his name into American pop culture, now reduced in the minds of millions to a single act of violence. And yet, this was no longer just about Will Smith. The backdrop of the slap had become the courtroom itself, a stage on which America debated not only forgiveness, but the meaning of failure, the elasticity of redemption, and the limits of humanity under the brightest lights. The camera zoomed closer, the conversation sharpened. The trial was only beginning. The air in the studio shifted, almost imperceptibly, as Michael Strahan straightened his back and folded his hands across his lap. It was the posture of a man preparing not to converse, but to dissect. The former NFL giant, once feared on the line of scrimmage, now carried the same authority into the quiet warfare of questioning. His voice, deep but controlled, cut through the hum of the cameras. "You've spoken about healing, Will," Strahan said, each syllable deliberate, weighted like evidence placed before a jury. "But healing begins with accountability. Do you believe what you did, striking another man on live television, was an act of strength or an act of weakness?" The studio fell into a silence so complete it felt orchestrated. Even the shifting of paper by producers behind the glass seemed to stop. Smith blinked. Once. Twice. His throat moved as he swallowed, though no words came immediately. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, mirroring Strahan's posture as if to absorb some of that grounded steadiness. Finally, his voice broke the stillness, quiet but urgent. "It was neither strength nor weakness," he said. "It was a fracture. A breaking point. In that moment, I was not the man I've tried to be. I was the boy I thought I left behind." The words were raw, but Strahan did not soften. He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes, as though assessing the testimony. "A breaking point," Strahan repeated, almost to himself. Then his tone hardened. "But breaking points do not excuse public violence, especially not from a man the world calls a role model." The accusation hung heavy, not shouted, but undeniable. Smith's hands tightened, fingers laced together, knuckles whitening under the pressure. He looked at Strahan and then past him, as if addressing something larger, the unseen jury watching at home. "I've carried weight my whole life," he admitted, his voice rising with a tremor. From a childhood where fists spoke louder than words, to decades in the spotlight where the world demanded perfection. That night, I cracked. I wish I hadn't. But it happened, and the world saw me not as human, but as failure. The narration enveloped the moment. Here was the paradox of Will Smith, a man built into myth, now trying to plead his humanity in a courtroom of morning television. Every syllable dripped with contrition, yet every defense risked sounding like excuse. Strahan did not blink. "But you were not alone that night," he pressed, voice low, sharp. "Millions of black boys looked up to you. They saw you as proof they could rise above violence, above stereotype. Did you not betray them in that moment?" The question landed like a gavel. Smith's chest rose sharply, as though the words had struck with more force than the slap itself. His lips parted, but for a beat, nothing emerged. When he did speak, it was slow, burdened. "I betrayed more than them," he confessed. "I betrayed my wife, my family, the people who believed in me, but I am not proud of that moment. I am haunted by it, and I am fighting every day not to let it define me." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a flicker of a second, the carefully composed star vanished, replaced by a trembling man. Narration drew the image wider. America watching from couches and phone screens, each viewer sliding unconsciously into the role of juror. Some nodded, hearing sincerity. Others shook their heads, dismissing it as performance. The split was palpable, the verdict undecided. Strahan leaned back at last, studying Smith as though weighing whether the man before him was witness or defendant, victim or perpetrator. His silence was not retreat, it was strategy. He had forced Smith into confession, into exposure, and now let the weight of it linger in the air. The studio audience sat frozen, as though exhaling might disturb the fragile equilibrium between them. The narration closed in tightly. This was not journalism, this was cross-examination. The questions were knives, the answers blood, and the man once untouchable now sat, cut open, before a nation unwilling to look away. The trial pressed forward. Will Smith shifted in his chair, his body taut with the exhaustion of being pressed into corners. The cameras caught everything, the twitch in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested against his thigh as though restraining itself. He was a man who knew every frame could be frozen, replayed, dissected, and yet he chose to lean forward, to strip away the shield of performance. "I was a man breaking in real time," he said, his voice trembling between composure and collapse. "People think it was about Chris, about a joke, but it wasn't just that. It was everything I'd carried, everything I never allowed myself to release. My father's fists, my silence as a boy, my need to protect, my fear of failing as a husband, as a man. That night, I cracked." The words spilled like testimony, each one trembling with the weight of memory. Strahan didn't interrupt. His gaze was steady, but his silence worked as effectively as any interruption. The stillness of his posture forced Smith to keep speaking, to fill the void with confession. "I've lived under the illusion of control," Smith continued. "Every smile, every laugh, every blockbuster, it was armor. And when people praised me for always being in control, for being the one who never cursed, never stumbled, they didn't see the cost. The cost was silence. The cost was swallowing every rage, every insecurity. And then, in 1 second, the dam burst." He paused, his eyes lowering. The studio was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of equipment. The producers, usually frantic with signals and cues, were frozen, sensing that what was unfolding was no ordinary interview. It was raw theater, courtroom testimony broadcast live. Smith lifted his head again, and his voice hardened with urgency. "I am not excusing what I did. I need people to hear that. I struck a man on live television. I own that. But what I am begging for is not erasure of that moment. It is the chance to be seen as more than that moment. I am not just the worst thing I've ever done." The plea echoed, both humble and defiant. Strahan shifted at last, his voice calm but unsparing. "But Will, you were not just any man breaking in real time. You were an icon, and millions of children, especially black children, saw that slap. They saw anger become violence. Can you really expect forgiveness so easily?" Smith's face tightened, a wince flickering across his features. He took a breath, eyes glistening. "Forgiveness is not in my control," he said softly. "I have apologized. I have reached out. But forgiveness belongs to those I hurt, not to me. All I can do is fight to live better, to own my flaws, to work so my children, my fans, those boys you speak of, can see that even when you fall, you get up. That's the only strength I have left." The narration surged around him. This was no longer the swaggering Fresh Prince, nor the invincible action hero. This was a man standing trial before a jury he could not see, stripped of charisma, asking not for absolution, but for recognition of humanity. The audience in the studio sat transfixed. Some clasped their hands, others leaned forward in their seats, caught in the gravity of confession. Viewers at home felt their own judgments tremble, not erased, but complicated. For the first time, Strahan's eyes softened, if only slightly. The cross-examiner had drawn blood, but what he found was not arrogance, not evasion, but a man pleading to be seen in full, scars and all. The silence lingered, heavier than any applause, more piercing than any condemnation. The narration closed. Will Smith was no longer merely defending an act. He was defending the right to imperfection, and whether the jury would allow that defense to stand was a question still unresolved, still burning under the studio lights. The trial moved forward, the stakes climbing with each breath. The trial was no longer confined to the bright, sterile studio of Good Morning America. The courtroom had spilled outward, across timelines, headlines, and living rooms, until every American with a screen had taken their seat on the jury. The slap was not an isolated crime scene. It was a living memory replayed on demand, a wound reopened every time someone pressed play. The testimony of public memory arrived in fragments, a chorus of voices, sometimes discordant, sometimes harmonious, always unrelenting. On Twitter, one user wrote, "Will Smith was my childhood, Fresh Prince, Men in Black, but that night he proved he's no different than the men we fear, violent when challenged." Another voice countered, "One mistake doesn't erase 30 years of brilliance. He cracked because he's human, haven't we all?" The words scrolled like affidavits entered into evidence. Opinion writers rehashed the moment with surgical precision. In the New York Times, one column declared, "Violence has no place in public discourse, no matter how beloved the actor." On cable news, pundits debated the penalty of privilege. If it were anyone else, one anchor sneered, they'd be in handcuffs, not giving apologies from mansions. But not all commentary carried the tone of condemnation. Some cultural critics reminded audiences of the broader story. Black men in Hollywood are asked to be flawless, untouchable, symbols of perfection. But perfection is not human. What Will Smith gave the world that night was a painful, imperfect truth. The narration framed these fragments as witnesses called to the stand. Each voice, each headline, each viral thread added weight to the scales of judgment. Public memory was no neutral record. It was active prosecution, active defense, a jury deliberating in real time. Inside the studio, Strahan seemed to channel these voices, his questions echoing their doubts and their demands. His role blurred between interviewer and vessel for the public's cross-examination. "You hear what people are saying," Strahan pressed, his voice even but firm. "Some say you've apologized enough. Others say no apology can undo what the world saw. Do you believe time can heal this, or do you fear this moment will always define you?" Smith shifted, his breath heavy, eyes lowered. His answer carried the weight of someone who had read every headline, every cruel meme, every defense, and every dismissal. "I know what the world saw," he said quietly, "and I know they'll replay it forever. Maybe I can't change that, but I can change what they see of me from this point forward. I can't erase the moment, but I don't want to live chained to it either." The narration magnified his words. The struggle was not simply for forgiveness, but for control over narrative itself. In the age of endless replay, redemption required not just sincerity, but persistence, resilience against a memory that refused to fade. The witnesses of public memory did not remain confined to journalists and fans. Other celebrities entered the courtroom too. Some distanced themselves, cautious. Others reached out, voices of solidarity. But every gesture became evidence, dissected, amplified, refracted back into the endless cycle of discourse. America was not merely watching Will Smith's trial, it was participating in it, constructing the case, tearing it down, rebuilding it again. And so, when Smith spoke of humanity, when he confessed to fracture, the question was never just whether Michael Strahan believed him. It was whether the millions watching, the jurors with remotes, phones and keyboards, would allow him to step out of the shadow of his worst moment. The cameras tightened on his face, the red light glaring like the unblinking eye of judgment. Strahan leaned back, letting silence do its work. The narration closed like a summation. Public memory had spoken, loud and fractured. Its verdict was not yet unanimous, but its testimony was clear. Will Smith was on trial not only for what he did, but for how America chose to remember it. The trial pressed onward, the jury restless, the evidence mounting. The temperature in the studio seemed to rise, though no one touched the thermostat. Michael Strahan leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, his frame filling the space between them like a wall of authority. The silence had stretched too long, and now it was his turn to press harder, to strip away what Smith had not yet revealed. "You say you're healing," Strahan began, his tone calm but unsparing. "But what of Chris Rock? What of the man you struck? Where is his healing?" The words were scalpel sharp, and the effect immediate. Smith's jaw tightened, his lips pulling into a thin line. He blinked once, twice, buying time. His hands, which had been steady on his lap, now fidgeted, fingers curling into fists before forcing themselves open again. His reply came low, almost muttered at first. "I reached out. I apologized, more than once, but forgiveness is not in my control." He lifted his eyes now, locking on Strahan's with sudden intensity. "I can't live chained to one mistake, waiting for another man to set me free." The words were louder, sharper, a flicker of the man who had exploded on Oscar night, barely restrained. Strahan didn't flinch. His gaze was level, his voice deliberate. "But isn't that the heart of accountability, Will? To wait, to sit in discomfort until the one you wronged is ready? Isn't redemption earned, not demanded?" The question hit harder than the slap itself. Smith's chest rose and fell, his breath heavy, audible in the hushed studio. He shifted forward, voice breaking through the quiet with raw urgency. "I am not demanding anything," he said. I am not asking the world to erase it. I live with it every day. Every morning I wake up, and that image, that sound, is there before I open my eyes. You think I don't carry that? You think I don't bleed from it still?" The narration cut in. This was no polished speech. The rhythm was uneven, jagged, the tone flaring with anger, collapsing into despair, then rising again like a tide. "I did what I could," Smith continued, his voice rising. "I sent the message, I spoke to the world, I admitted my wrong, but if forgiveness doesn't come, what am I supposed to do? Crawl forever? Let one mistake destroy everything I've built, everything I am? I can't live like that." The audience in the studio gasped, the sound collective, involuntary. For the first time, Smith's tone bordered on defiance, his defenses burning hotter than contrition. Strahan's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a pursing of the lips. He had drawn out the edge, the volatility that still lived beneath Smith's measured surface, but he did not pounce. Instead, he let the silence hang, thick and suffocating, before speaking with deliberate calm. "Then maybe the world isn't ready to move on. Maybe the healing you speak of is not yours to declare finished." The words hung like a verdict, sharp and unforgiving. Smith inhaled sharply, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as though to block out the glare of the cameras. When he opened them again, his gaze was glassy, vulnerable. His voice softened, almost a whisper now. "I can't make the world forgive me," he said. "But I can't stop living either. I have children who look at me not as a headline, but as a father, I have work, I have family, I have life still beating in me. If I'm trapped forever in that night, then what's the point of trying? The narration drew close. Here was the paradox. A man begging for release while still bound to the very chains he claimed to reject. The clash was no longer just between interviewer and interviewee. It was between two ideas of justice, one demanding patience, silence, penance. The other